Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Zainab Usman, Director of the Africa Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Here at Carnegie Africa, we focus on the economic, the political, and the transnational issues shaping Africa's future. Today, we will be discussing one of the most significant issues for African development in the emerging post-pandemic world, and this is infrastructure. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, developing countries require an estimated $40 trillion for infrastructure and development financing to position them on the path to strong recovery and prosperity. The African continent itself will need an estimated $150 billion of investment per annum for at least the next 10 years. But for the last 2 decades or so, it is Chinese entities that have been the major financiers of infrastructure projects in Africa, more recently through the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. Actually, more than 65% of Chinese development financing to the African public sector goes to infrastructure, whereas development financing from OECD countries has primarily focused on social sectors. And OECD countries are countries in Europe, in North America, including also Australia and New Zealand, and so on. So these countries, their development financing has primarily focused on social sectors like health, like population, like education, humanitarian aid, and poverty reduction. Up to 55%, in fact, of this financing goes to these social sectors. But this year, the group of seven, the G7, launched the Build Back Better World Initiative, also known as the B3W. The B3W is described as a values-driven, high-standard, and transparent infrastructure partnership aimed at mobilizing infrastructure investments in low and middle income countries, including those in Africa. Now, the G7, as you all know, is an informal bloc of industrialized democracies, including the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom. While Western media coverage of the B3W frames the initiative in extremely competitive terms, that China and the US are engaged in geopolitical rivalry or strategic competition, or that the B3W is the anti-BRI, the reality is likely to be much more complex. The core details of the B3W remain ambiguous, as the BRI actually, while the BRI has about, a decade or even 2 decades of experience behind it. But the fact that the G7 is moving forward on this particular initiative has important consequences for Africa. I mean, one has to wonder how the G7 would position the B3W vis-a-vis the BRI. Would it be a complement? Could it be more than just a Western alternative to Chinese influence? Can the two initiatives meet Africa's financing needs? And how can the African continent avoid the negative spillovers of great power competition that we're seeing increasingly becoming a reality? And also, what is the role of African policymakers in negotiating this tangled geopolitical landscape? Which then brings us to really our central question here today. Can China's BRI and the G7's B3W coexist in Africa? And to address this question, I have with me today a distinguished panel of leading US, China, and Africa policy experts. So we have with us Dr. Yuen Yuaneng. She is an associate professor of political science at the University of Michigan. She is an author of the award-winning book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, and her new book is called China's Gilded Age. We also have with us Mr. Connor Savoy. He is a senior fellow with the Project on Prosperity and Development at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, he was the executive director of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, an advocacy coalition focused on increased U.S. foreign aid effectiveness. We also have with us Dr. David Day. He actually just told me how to pronounce his name today, and that hasn't really sunk in. Dr. Day is founder and managing director of Africa Economics. He was formerly economic advisor to the government of Rwanda. He was a public finance expert to the Kenya Constitutional Review Committee of Experts, and also an economic advisor on the economic recovery strategy, credited with Kenya's post-2003 recovery. And finally, we have Ms. Anzetse Were. She is senior economist at Financial Sector Deepening Kenya. Her fields of expertise include manufacturing and private sector development. We're very happy to have them here with us today. So before we start, let me quickly explain how we're structuring this discussion. Each speaker will provide about 12 to 13 minute remarks until around 11 a.m., after which 11 a.m. here in DC, so for about an hour, we'll have this discussion with all four of them. After which we will open for a live question and answer session where you can ask our speakers questions. And to ask a question, all you need to do is to use the live chat feature in YouTube that you should see on the right side of your screen. So now, let's start with Connor. Let us introduce the B3W for those who have not heard of it, or who have heard of it but are not really sure what the initiative means in practical terms. So Connor, can you tell us what is the G7's vision for the B3W and what commitments it comprises of, and what really the B3W proposes for the African continent in particular?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me here today. It's wonderful to join Carnegie's Africa program, and this is a very timely and important topic. Very briefly, B3W really was launched at the G7 meeting that just concluded in June in the UK, and I think it builds on some groundwork that was laid during the Trump administration, where there was increasing interest amongst the G7 countries in how they can better coordinate around development finance initiatives, and builds off of the DFI Alliance that was launched a couple of years ago, as well as the Blue Dot Network, which was an effort to bring about more quality infrastructure investments across developing countries. And so, B3W is really meant to be a global, coordinated infrastructure investment program by the G7 countries. They've identified 4 areas that they want to focus on, 1 being climate, 2 being health and health security, 3 being digital technology, and 4 being gender equity and equality. And as you noted, they want to take a values-driven, high standard and transparent approach. I think that phrase, those words were chosen very specifically because, as you noted, this is seen by some, I think, as a counter to BRI, and is about bringing different standards to infrastructure investments. It has a very lofty goal. They note that they want to bring hundreds of billions of dollars in additional infrastructure investments to lower income countries and middle income countries. While it's meant to be global, they also are clearly looking at it from a regional perspective and identify Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Indo-Pacific as regions of focus. And they do note that different G7 partners may focus on one region versus another. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see, for example, Japan taking a stronger interest in investment across the Indo-Pacific, where it already has a fairly significant presence via JICA and JBIC, the Japanese Bank for International Cooperation, or, for example, some of the European DFIs taking a stronger interest in Sub-Saharan Africa, given their significant footprint already on the continent. And I would just say, I think one of the other main things is that they really this is this is meant to be different in that its aim is to mobilize private capital in particular, and work alongside the multilateral development banks, and other IFIs, international financial institutions, to drive greater investment here. Um, this is not, Belt and Road has been characterized by and large by sort of state to state financing initiatives. And this is really meant to be about mobilizing private capital and creating the conditions where private institutional investors, pension funds, large institutional investors, asset management companies are going to look at infrastructure as in Africa and elsewhere as as a good place to invest. Zainab, you're muted, I think.
This is very interesting to hear that you've got first of all 7 countries involved, then you've got multilateral institutions also who will be involved. But even among those 7 countries, you've got different entities. In the US, for example, you've got the Development Finance Corporation, you've got the Exim Bank, and a couple of other entities. And then, in Japan, you've got JICA and all of those. So one question then is, how will this be coordinated with this multiplicity of actors and institutions?
I think it's a great question. And I think this is one of the real challenges that I see for this to be successful. You mentioned you've got 7 countries, you've got 7 development finance institutions, you have 7 aid agencies within those countries. And that's not even talking about the United States, where they talk about where the Biden administration has talked about an interagency process involving the Development Finance Corporation, State Department, USAID, U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. I think on the U.S. side, we have a good example in Power Africa. That has been a very successful interagency process that was designed to bring together the full force of the U.S. government to drive increased investment toward power generation in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think, and I hope that the Biden administration will be really looking at that, at least for the U.S. in its engagement, as a good blueprint for how this could work from a U.S. government perspective. I think where the bigger challenge, though, is really going to be with coordinating these 7 countries plus engagement on the multilateral side of things. You're talking about 7 different deal processes with these DFIs. You're talking about 7 different approaches to due diligence. You have 7 different deal sheets. And that's going to be a problem, because the only way this succeeds from a resourcing perspective is if you're pursuing co-financing and co-investment. You're going to need the DFC to invest alongside UK's CDC group. You're going to need them to then invest alongside DEG, the German Development Finance Institution. And then you're likely going to then need, in Africa context, the African Development Bank and the World Bank bring in additional financing. That's going to be challenging. And I will say, I think there's been some progress to date. I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, the DFI Alliance, as well as the Blue Dot Network, and these are ongoing efforts to try to create more commonality, more in the defense sense, more interoperability between these DFIs. And there's progress, but there's still more that needs to be done. And I do think this is an area where there needs to be a clear leadership, and I suspect that the Biden-Harris administration wants to use this as a vehicle to sort of reassert American global leadership, and certainly leadership in the multilateral side of things. And so I think B, you're going to need sort of clear agreement on how you create an easier financing mechanism that still allows for these high standards that they want to bring to this, that you're not simply saying, well, we're going to sacrifice, for example, environmental, social, and governance standards in just to get investments done more quickly. And so it's going to be a challenge.
So, a question then on the minds of many, especially in African countries, would be that, this is a lofty and very admirable vision that has been set out by the G7 countries. But then, how does this vision for embarking on, this massive infrastructure push, how does it square with the domestic realities in these countries, these G7 countries? In Europe, we've got rising populism, driven by concerns around, a lack of sufficient socio-economic investments in these domestic economies. In the US, there are huge needs for infrastructure investments. You listen to the discourse among the public intellectuals in the US, where we both live, and it's all about trying to upgrade airports and roads and bridges, which are all there, but they need to be upgraded. And we're all aware of the Biden administration's proposed infrastructure bill, right? The American Jobs Plan and all of those. So how does this vision around the B3W square with these domestic realities, and then how do you take into account the priorities of African countries in all this mix?
It's a great question, and I think at a very macro level, I think we have a window of opportunity right now, as the world enters a recovery, or we hope a recovery period from COVID-19. I think that has driven home for many in the United States, and I hope in Western Europe, that these pandemics, whatever it may be, these are transnational threats. And if we're not trying to tackle them over there, where they may originate in China or elsewhere, then it is going to affect us at some point. The ocean does not protect us from things like a pandemic anymore. The ocean does not protect us from a lot of things. And I think this is a window of opportunity to really look at some of the clear where there is investment needed. I think it should become as no surprise that one of the key areas that the B3W wants to invest in is health and health systems. There's a lot to be done there. That's obviously a much broader vision of what infrastructure means, and you see that in the current debate here in the United States over what that actually means. But I do think we have a window of opportunity. That said, we are going to have to balance the resources, and I think that is a major reason why this initiative is not about state-to-state financing. We don't have the resources to offer, for example, low-cost loans to the government, from the government to the United States to an African government. We don't do that. We've gotten out of the business of sovereign loans and sovereign loan guarantees. And what this is really, it's flipping it on its head and saying, how can we use our existing official finance through the DFC or through European DFIs to catalyze private capital, to mobilize private capital to address these very real concerns. And the reality is there is a lot of capital out there. There is a tremendous amount of capital for infrastructure investments, but what's ultimately needed frequently is some kind of de-risking tool. And whether that's improved project preparation, feasibility studies, or simply investors like the DFC that are willing to take on riskier tranches within an investment, that is how they ultimately see it. And I think it's a long way of saying that, in my mind, is how you thread this needle between those domestic concerns that you mentioned and the very real resources that are needed across sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. And I think on the country, and I think you bring up a really, as a sort of subsidiary point, is how do we meet the demands of the countries themselves? And I think this is a very sort of belated recognition that what many countries in Africa and elsewhere want is infrastructure investment. You don't have to spend too much time in a country like Uganda or Tanzania and realize that infrastructure is a huge barrier to growth. You travel down the street and you're in the middle of in the middle of a city, and you can turn a road and the road just disappears because there is no investment in this. And this is an opportunity, I think, for us to actually meet the demands. And and focus a little bit less on, I think, what we want to do and what makes us feel better, and really shift it to more of a demand side conversation, and meet the hopes and aspirations of these countries, as opposed to simply and I don't want to say in all instances, but in many instances, scratching our own ideological itches that we have in Washington and elsewhere.
Excellent. So really trying to align interests and priorities here,
Yes.
on the supply side and also on the demand side.
Yes.
So I'll come back to you. Now, let me go for her to help provide some background on the BRI. Now, Yuan, there seems to be a disconnect between popular conceptions of the BRI, that's the Belt and Road Initiative, as a detailed infrastructure plan, and the reality of a more elaborate and less defined package of many components. And you have pointed out that there is tremendous confusion surrounding the BRI. In your words, the BRI may be the most talked about and least defined buzzword of this decade. So can you explain to us why this confusion exists? And how does this confusion affect relations between China and other countries, especially signatories to the BRI? I think you're on mute.
Right.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for having me. First of all, Zainab, I wanted to thank you for this conversation, because so often any discussion of BRI is fixated on competition, and you have moved the narrative in the direction of complementarity and coexistence. I think that's much needed, and I wanted to applaud that. Going back to your question, yes, earlier on, I wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs on China's BRI. And I had observed that the BRI may be the most talked about and least defined buzzword of this decade. And so maybe let me start by describing the confusion that I see on the ground and why it exists and what are the implications. The short answer for why we see confusion on the ground with regard to BRI is that in reality, in China's global policy, there is a gap between policy ambition and policy implementation. And this gap is often neglected or not understood, because most people have the impression that China, being this powerful state, must surely be able to execute and achieve any goals that it has set for itself. And in reality, I find that that's actually often not the case. So let me describe a little bit my work on BRI. Before the pandemic, I was working with the United Nations and UNDP on the impact of BRI and how it can be leveraged for inclusive, sustainable development in Cambodia, which is a country that is a prime destination for Chinese investments in Southeast Asia. And I've also talked to officials in other parts of Southeast Asia about their impression of BRI. And through these experiences, I came to a core observation, which is that despite this explosion of attention on BRI, there was immense ambiguity and confusion about BRI on the ground and in reality. There is no official definition from Beijing of what is a BRI project, and there is no official list of who is an authorized participant. And so when you actually go to a country like Cambodia and look for BRI projects, what you find is actually a gradation of BRI-ness, so BRI qualities. So on the top, there are some evidently BRI projects, and these are the large infrastructure projects that most people focus on, funded by Chinese loans and aid, usually built by Chinese contractors like railways, highways, and so forth. But then below that, there is a whole plethora of state to private and private to private partnerships, such as industrial parks, that have no Chinese government loans or funding, but they are also branded as BRI. And then right at the bottom, you have pretty much any Chinese investments or presence, and those are often equated to BRI, even if they have nothing to do with the initiative. And it's important to understand that Chinese investors all want to be labeled as BRI, because They want to be part of the policy bandwagon. They want to appear to be answering the party's call for BRI. So in practice, you can find anything can be labeled as BRI, infrastructure, schools, tourism, and even real estate. So when you have this complete ambiguity and confusion, what happens on the ground is that whenever problems happen in association with any type of Chinese investment, the BRI gets blamed. And so that's how it came to acquire quite a negative impression in parts of the world, resulting sometimes in anti-Chinese sentiments. So let me get back to your question now that I've kind of painted the portrait. So why do we see this confusion? And the reason, as I've already previewed, is that there is, in practice, a gap between China's policy ambition and China's policy implementation. On paper, the BRI looks like a well thought out, ambitious, grand scheme to build a China-led world order. If you look at the BRI map, it draws 6 economic corridors. It looks really well planned, and one has to admit that. But in reality, Beijing gives very little guidance on implementation. And you'll be surprised at how little guidance that it gave. For example, the central guiding document for BRI, this was from 2015 to 17, was only 7 pages long. And I'm talking about big font. And it only sketched broad principles like go where the demand is. There's no blueprint. There's no timeline, there's no budget, no specification of which agencies are in charge, no limits on participation, no consideration of potential problems, and so forth. So when you look at the ambition on paper and you look at the reality of implementation, some people might be surprised, but people who know Chinese politics will not be surprised, because the BRI is what in Chinese politics we call a policy campaign. And this is a routine Chinese practice where the top leader says, BRI is cool. BRI is the thing that the whole country should be doing. And it mobilizes the entire society to devote their attention to the BRI. So people jump in, they invest quickly, they build quickly, they break many things along the way. And then the leadership will step back a few years later and say, well, we didn't anticipate that there would be all these problems. And so now it's time to clean up. And so indeed, in 2018, which is 5 years after the BRI was launched, President Xi Jinping then for the first time mentioned the need for quality. And he used an analogy from Chinese painting. He said, we need to switch from broad brushstroke painting to refined style of painting. So the short answer is that the Chinese government has a very different style and logic of policy making. It's very different from the Western tradition, where you typically have very little gap between policy formulation and policy implementation. And so that's why it is very important for China to communicate this difference, and for other countries in Africa working with China to understand the fundamental differences in policymaking in China as compared to the Western G7 nations.
Excellent. So this is really fascinating, because your insights on the BRI, which of course I've followed elsewhere, the work you've written with Foreign Affairs and in other such publications, and what you're explaining to us now. Clearly, it seems that the BRI is a campaign, as you mentioned. It's this campaign, is this vision statement, which is vague and maybe deliberately so, because it then incentivizes different entities, different actors to really kind of fall in line and label their projects and initiatives as BRI, right? Since there's that kind of top political support for it. But then, of course, the danger being if anything fails, it's also labeled as BRI, whereas, ultimately it's just a campaign and an umbrella for everyone to kind of fit into or fit under. So then a question is, from the African perspective, or from the perspective of many stakeholders and actors in Africa, we've heard from Connor, now we've heard from you explaining B3W and BRI respectively. They both seem like huge vision statements and campaigns by two global powers, right? From that perspective, for many stakeholders in Africa, there might be differences here and there, but it's still two global powers leading initiatives for a whole host of reasons. So a question is, are there, from your perspective, specific areas of complementarities for places like Africa, for both the BRI and the B3W? Could there be, for example, joint financing or supervision or quality control, leveraging the respective strengths of the global powers behind these initiatives? And I say this because in my mind, I think about London, the UK, for example, which is a country that is part of the G7. And one of the key strengths of the UK is its financial and legal services and systems. And, there are lawyers in the UK that are they're called Magic Circle lawyers. They're really good at helping to negotiate any financing deal that you can think of. And, one could plausibly assume that, the UK could really leverage on that strength, on that comparative advantage, as opposed to trying to engage in the endeavor of building high-speed rail lines. To be frank, when you think about the UK, building high-speed rail lines is not what comes to mind immediately. So my roundabout way of putting forward a question to you that are there complementarities for places like Africa between the BRI and the B3W?
I think it's a great question, a great point. And I do think that there are areas of complementarities. I would add that in an ideal world, the two superpowers would cooperate, but realistically, cooperation is very difficult at this point. So as a start, let's think about what are the areas of complementarities where they can at least coexist. And I think for starters, it is helpful for both China, the G7, and the countries in Africa to realize a fundamental feature, which I think is that in the area of infrastructure financing, Chinese and Western initiatives have different strengths and weaknesses. So let's start by spelling out their different strengths and weaknesses. So in the Chinese case, the advantage of the BRI is that it is very large scale. The decisions are made very quickly. A lot of money is poured in. Things are quickly built. And in general, Chinese capital tends to be more patient. So it's willing to invest in long-term projects that private investors otherwise may not be interested to consider. However, it also comes with certain disadvantages. Chinese projects tend to lack consultation, transparency, and accountability, and these are things that are valued in democracies. Now, conversely, if you turn to Western initiatives, they also have their own strengths and weaknesses. The advantage in Western projects is that due diligence is done. Every step is carefully documented. We care a great deal about assessing social impact before implementation. But the downside of that same strength is that the process is slow, it's not decisive. And from a politician's point of view, frankly, they find it bureaucratic, right? And a real hassle. So I think at the outset, what BRI receiving countries should consider is that the Western and Chinese initiatives have different pros and cons. Some are big and fast, and some are small and refined. So I would encourage policymakers to have a portfolio mindset. That is to think about development as coming in the form of portfolio with different types of projects, and to think about who is a better fit for different types of projects. There may be instances where you need to build a big infrastructure project that requires massive funding and should be done quickly. There may be other instances where you want to focus on more social types of projects where the scale is not so large, but you're really sensitive to sustainability and social inclusion. So the takeaway is, I think, for the G7 nations to avoid this perception that they should match China on its scale and speed. That is not wise or realistic because that's playing to the weaknesses of the G7 nations. The strength of democracy is that we do things slowly and deliberately, but generally the quality, transparency, and accountability is higher. So actually the two different systems have very different strengths and weaknesses. And that's where I see to be a starting point when we think about complementarity.
Excellent. Just to make sure, okay, I'm on mute. I'm not muted. So, I mean, this is really excellent, Ewan. Thanks for helping us really understand what the BRI is, what it brings to the table, what it does well, what it doesn't do well at all, and really to look at those potential complementarities if policymakers were to pursue that course with the B3W. And I'll come back to you in a bit. Now we're going to bring in our third speaker, Nzetse, who is going to help us describe the current infrastructure investment landscape in many parts of Africa. So Nzetse, in practical terms, what might the B3W mean for various sectors in African economies, like Kenya, where you are currently located? Would you say that there are potential overlaps between the sectoral focus of the BRI and the B3W? What can you tell us here?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this. I mean, I think if you look at the current infrastructure investment landscape, we all know about the financing gap, but when you actually look at the top financiers, African governments actually above China. If you look at the actual, liability. So I think that is not something that should be forgotten. The sense of responsibility that African governments have really put to the table. In terms of the sectoral bias right now, it's very much energy and then transports and logistics. And then we have some wash, ICT, and then some more multi-sector. But I think if you're talking about B3W and particularly BRI and the sectoral focus, I think I'm just going to echo what has been said. There are definitional problems in B3W beyond the value statement that's been said. And the evolving nature of the BRI, I think, is something that, frankly, the African continent has benefited from because it's allowed a bit more of an organic approach to meet the emerging infrastructure needs that the continent has as it proceeds. So I do agree with Yuen that it's been very amorphous, it's been very difficult to define, and has run into trouble in many ways, but it has allowed a certain level of flexibility and adaptability in then African governments being able to intersect their varied infrastructure needs with what can look like a very monolithic process. The key, I think, nuts of the matter will be looking at the actual capabilities that B3W is going to deploy in the context of African infrastructure priorities. Yeah. So I think just bear in mind, from a political economy perspective, the fact that the B3W is being phrased in a geopolitically charged manner, I think makes the reality of trilateral cooperation outside of the G7 in terms of practical, pragmatic realities of infrastructure investment in Africa, that tension is there, yeah? And I think just to echo what Yuan was saying, sometimes we do need all the different capabilities, but the framing, I think, is something that has increased the tensions. So I'm just going to give you the capabilities that infrastructure investment requires in Africa to make a material effect. The first is the technical capabilities. The reality is that particularly the US has not built infrastructure in Africa in a very long time. If you look at the main project that the US is doing in a country like Kenya, which was meant to be the Mombasa-Nairobi Expressway, that was announced in 2017, the ground still hasn't been broken. So there is something to be said around an appetite to do viable infrastructure investment and then the technical capabilities to get that actually going. The second thing that people, I think, have underestimated, but I think has been alluded to, are the political economy capabilities, which are considerable, because you're going to be managing very high-profile, sensationalized infrastructure investments. China gets its fair share of this, often very negative media portrayal of what's going on in China. It's really around the environment and labor. But again, in the B3W, that scrutiny is going to be there. We've already been seeing some of that in the PPP discussions, in the Betcho. We're also seeing in the corruption issues, and it's not that there is corruption, but sort of a value alignment there. The political economy capabilities are considerable. So if this is going to be a private sector driven DFI initiative, those capabilities need to be nascent and ready to deal with very high profile realities. The third thing is what we all know, the financing capabilities. We all know B3W, has taken issue with the opaque financing style of BRI. But at the end of the day, we're not clear what those projects are going to cost. We don't know the cost of the financing. We don't know the packaging the financing is going to be in. What will be the value for money in African governments' minds? And then how will this add to the debt burden? We're already in an environment where everybody has reduced relief to Africa or support to Africa to debt. And now we're adding a very aggressive financing program that's going to exacerbate that. So there needs to be some clarity there. The third big thing is the digital capabilities. We're not clear on what that's going to look like. We already know China, and rightly, as Juan said, the digital capabilities of China in the context of BRI are not clear, but we know that those are considerable, they're deep, and China has had basically a 10 to 15-year lead in terms of building the hard infrastructure, but increasingly the soft infrastructure that African governments are then building their digital transformation on. What are the capabilities, really, that B3W is bringing to the table that China is not already offering? Yeah. And then finally is the green capabilities. As much as B3W says they want to be climate friendly, high standards, etc., the reality is that will this become a de facto exclusionary force for particularly domestic African players in participating in B3W? While I agree the standards question is very important, the reality is that it can become a form of discrimination. We've seen this a lot in the way certain types of financing are deployed into Africa, and then it really narrows the pool of meaningful engagement, particularly in Africa infrastructure players. So I think really the practical realities are going to be those.
Yeah, thanks a lot for outlining those specific capabilities. I would say I think those are very, very important points, especially the last one. And with respect to the B3W, where I guess there's still an opportunity to shape things, right? This vision has been laid out, and things will be fleshed out over the coming weeks and months. And the last point about green financing and ensuring that does not become a mechanism for inadvertently excluding African countries on various bases. So already we've seen a number of announcements from G7 countries, the UK, even the US, about completely stopping the financing of fossil fuel projects, right? And for a number of African countries, they are actually starting to speak up to say, actually, this could be exclusionary because they're not at that stage yet where they can completely, in a year or two, shift away from dependence on fossil fuels. So that's, I think, a very, very important point. Before I move to David, I think one last question that I'd like to put forward to you, Anzetse, is I think the other elephant in the room for a number of African countries is around their own capabilities in the public sector, in the civil service, in their bureaucracies. And we all know that even if you want to have a market-driven economy, you still need the anchor of the state. You still need that foundation of strong and effective bureaucracies, actually. So one question to you is, in what ways might bureaucrats in Kenya or bureaucracies in Kenya leverage the B3W to strengthen their institutional capacity and influence infrastructure project negotiations? And as I mentioned earlier, for example, thinking about the role that lawyers can play in helping shore up the capacity of some African countries to negotiate these infrastructure deals. Is there a role there for the B3W to play? And do you see any specific differences or variations between or among various countries in, say, East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa? Are there variations that you see across the continent?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way I can answer that is that the B3W, like the BRI, will operate in the political economy of technocracy. That's what really is going to come down to. And so when you're looking at large infrastructure pushes that interface deeply with African governments, there are really 5 ways that that agency in the African side will then interface either with the B3W or the BRI. The first is what you said, the technocratic capacity in the finance ministries, the technical ministries, from the senior to the junior level, will have a material effect on getting things off the ground, which is very important in high-level announcement. There has to be a sense of things are actually getting done, and it's just not another story that Africans are being told. So that capacity issue is real, and there will be an emphasis on technical transfer, particularly on the technical side of things. I think you'll see that expectation. The coordination thing has already been raised. You know, it's not like the African governments have one office where you can find African government agency and capacity and coordination. Within African governments, there are different views as to what should be prioritized. So that coordination within governments and now between different African governments and then now the G7 and that coordination issue is going to be fascinating to see what practical structures are going to be set up to actually deal with that, because those become the bottlenecks that then lead to a lot of delays. The other big thing that B3W, like BRI, is going to deal with is commitment. Long-term infrastructure projects are punctuated by 5-year election cycles in Africa. That's just the way things are. And these are very contested, they're very acrimonious, they tend to be very disruptive. And the reality is that that has a material effect on the commitment to the deals that were made, particularly when there are shifts in administration. You have to come back and make sure everybody is together again. And the other big thing that tends to interfere with commitment are the vested interests. We all know these are there, the local vested interests, the global vested interests, and then the public sentiment around that. The other big thing that B3W, frankly, will be grappling with is the features of corruption in the way African governments operate. We've already seen this in the Nairobi-Mombasa Expressway. It will be fascinating to figure out how they're going to do that. Will they take more of the way AFDB and the World Bank, how they approach that and the issues that come with that, or how are they going to really deal with that? And then the final is the competition. And the political economy of geopolitical competition and infrastructure development really, the biggest challenge, I think, particularly from an African perspective, is developing the capacity to deal with all these different interests that are now being put on the table by all these different parties, and ensuring that Africa's priorities are centered, which in my view, in the context of infrastructure, should really be around the African Continental Free Trade Area. The AU has already made very clear what it is thinking around those priorities for infrastructure, create jobs for the youth, make sure you connect to rural areas, make sure it's climate resilient, make sure the financing is sustainable, and really making sure that B3W is actually listening to those priorities rather than coming with a very value-driven approach that's supply-driven.
Yeah, I think those are really, really great points about the reality of the political economy in many countries, right? Around, how the technocracy itself operates, what capabilities exist there, the reality of electoral cycles that come every 4 to 6 years in many countries, and how that would really shape, how these projects are in and of themselves executed. And whether a project is put to the side or it's revived. In the case of Tanzania, as we've heard recently, the Bagamoyo port, the President Samia Suluhu Hassan has revived it. Everybody thought that project was more or less dead. So you have those political economy realities that really would shape and contextualize how these big kind of global visions actually play out in reality. Now we're going to move to, we'll bring, and I'll come back to you, Nzetse. We're going to bring on our fourth speaker, David Nde, to also provide some more contextual insights on both the BRI and the B3W in Africa, and specifically around Kenya and East Africa, where he's currently located. Obviously, today we have a strong Kenya contingent, so that is really good. So David, Kenya is the largest economy in East Africa and is a recipient of significant infrastructure financing, including that conveyed through the BRI. And since at least the year 2001, China has extended more than $9 billion in loans to Kenya. And Chinese infrastructure projects are quite numerous, the big ones, including the expansion of the Mombasa port, the recently constructed deep sea port at Lamu, and the laying of the standard gauge railway across the country. But the BRI, or at least BRI associated projects in Kenya, have also been implicated in corruption, in debt, in concerns, environmental concerns, really. So my question to you is, what are the implications of the advent of the B3W for a country like Kenya, which is a signatory to the BRI? And what specific gaps can the B3W address in Kenya from your perspective, and other countries in East Africa?
Thank you very much, Zainab. I am glad to see you, happy to see you again, both you and Anzetsa for inviting me. I think that is letting the cat out of the bag, that the three of us were on another China something discussion, I think an Oxford University something a couple of weeks ago, which so I think at least I'm seeing you, and thanks very much for initiating this, I think, important conversation at this point in time. I think it's going to be very, very critical for African policymakers to engage some of the questions that you have posed. I want to start at a point of stock taking, so that it can be a bit evidence based. I like to operate. I find it difficult to navigate subjects without numbers. So I'll put up a slide.
As a true economist.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I started my life crunching numbers and I've never recovered. So I hope you can put up a slide. Are we able to put it up?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, there you go. So this will help me to be very brave, because what you have on the top panel is some chart on growth decomposition. It's from an IMF report of a couple of, about 2 years ago. And what you see is the first panel is Africa. The second panel is other developing countries. The dark blue is the growth due to physical investment. The other blue is due to human capital. Then the green is due to labor, and the orange or brown one is due to productivity. And what you see is from 2014, you have very what you call factor accumulation-led growth, predominantly by physical investment. The kind of thing, infrastructure we're talking about. Then you have a decline in growth. And in fact, from 2015 to 17, you see negative productivity growth. And then you have a forecast, which IMF is always optimistic, which suggesting that growth will recover and on less investment, but that was pre-COVID. If you look at the rest of the developing world, what you see is a very big red bar, which is productivity growth. So if you look at Africa, growth is factor accumulation led, I would say in economics, and the rest of the developing world is productivity led. Now, if you're borrowing to finance capital and you have no productivity growth, you're going to end up with debt distress. So, and that's where we've ended up, because productivity growth is what pays for your investment. So Africa is, although we're talking about sort of growth, which was averaging 5%, down to about 3%. So there's something not going right. We're not getting productivity growth out of our investment. Our incremental capital output ratio is gone out of whack. The other two charts below tell you something different. If you look at those bars, that is agricultural productivity, which is a long-term agricultural productivity using cereal yield as an indicator. And you see Africa standing out there with almost stagnant agricultural productivity over the long haul. I think that is the most distinct feature of African economic underdevelopment, that sort of failure for agricultural productivity to rise. And of course, I put it there and I juxtapose it with population growth. So the same chart, the same green line is the same brown line on the other chart of agricultural productivity. And you can see a huge gap between growth in population and lack of agricultural productivity growth. I like to call that gap the Malthusian gap. And if we don't deal with that, then you get macro imbalances, you get that, you get probably political crisis out of that. And it's very easy to use that particular thing to see some of the political developments in Africa. So why am I using that? I think I am making the point that infrastructure is not necessarily applewood and motherhood and apple pie for African development. I think it actually starkly isn't. What you see, I think, underlying this performance is two things. Why you have low productivity is obviously there is the mismatch where the money is going, which is physical infrastructure, mostly transport, utilities, electricity, telecoms and stuff like that, and where the top priority of investment should be public goods like agricultural research. So the public goods are not getting the money, which should raise agricultural productivity. The money is going. You saw the US, for instance, shift its focus from what they were calling Feed the Future to raise agricultural productivity to power Africa. And that was in response to Chinese competition, because they saw Chinese competing going into big infrastructure, and the US felt it was missing out, and therefore it looked at the sector that would give a sort of US business a leg up in this competition. The other thing is, so what you get is private capital in particular, cherry picking what somebody called, I was quite amused to hear that word, de-risked investments. So they're looking for low risk, large projects, huge transactions. That's how you end up with mega infrastructure projects in the PPPs and all of that. The other thing you have, of course, is something I call scale asymmetry. That if you look at sector like agriculture, Africa's agriculture is smallholder. If you look at where most people are working, it's in small and micro enterprises. So what you need is risk capital in small quantities, in small scale, maybe 100,000 up to maybe $1 million of investment in enterprises. But what the investors are looking for is large ticket items from $1 billion upwards. Yeah, so you have again that mismatch. So what you have then ended up with is a convergence of the interests of politicians who want big projects, financiers, of course, who are looking for large transactions, and vendors, you know, from whether you're talking about China Road and Bridge, or you're talking about US construction companies and everybody, or whoever, they are all looking for the same thing. But those are not Africa's development priorities at the moment. That's what those pictures are telling us. There is that mismatch. What do we see with the B3W? One, I want to point out that it sounds like B3W has already decided what the priorities are. Yeah, this is what they want to do. So there is very little, I think, scope for African ownership. It's again sort of driven from outside, and they also say that it's got conditionalities on values and all sorts of things, which is precisely why the Chinese projects China has been able to do much better, because China says that's precisely what it does not do. China does not decide its own priorities. It allows the countries and consults the countries. And as China says, it does not impose political conditions or its own values, or whatever. So it seems to me that that raises the question whether really they are on the same sort of track. Are they going to compete? Because I think if an African country is told that this is government, that you can only invest in these sectors, and you must conform to the following conditions, and you have China without conditions, I think we know where they're going to go. So I don't know how that changes. So that's the perspective. I think that your second question.
Yes, I mean that is profound, and I had pre-prepared a second question, but I think I'm going to modify it slightly. Then, you have said to us essentially that what Africa needs is interventions, investments around public goods that can help increase productivity, because without increasing productivity, we're going to keep experiencing these macroeconomic challenges around debt, around exogenous shocks and things like that. But even the infrastructure investments that everybody's talking about, what you're saying is those are simply insufficient. They're good. They're a good starting point there, but they are simply insufficient. And unfortunately, at least as you've explained it, and I think it's a very compelling point, that you have this convergence of interests among, policymakers and politicians in Africa, financiers elsewhere, and vendors, the construction companies and so on, around these big mega infrastructure projects, but they're just not enough. So a question then is, how do you align all these interests to areas, the public goods that you mentioned, which can help increase productivity in Africa? Because essentially that is the essential thing. You showed us, and I really like that you showed us those the slides and the charts on the growth decomposition of different regions of the world, where you find that it is for Africa, the TFP, total factor productivity, has not really been driving growth. And in fact, if one even wants to go a bit further to the 90s and to the 80s, you find that, consistently throughout those 2 decades, TFP actually was just contracting, or TFP growth was contracting. So the question is then, how do you do this? How do you align these interests to focus on the priorities in Africa that can help address this TFP growth, that can help increase productivity, since that is the crux of the matter?
I think the main challenge that the people are facing out there is that Africa's is that their approach, their lens is very finance led, and it's finance led partly because I guess that's all they have, money. But also, secondly, and it was mentioned, is that there is a shortage of investment, high return investment opportunities. You see it in the markets where you have sort of bond investors chasing yield and doing all sorts of things, which they've been doing lately. You hear a lot about finding a place to invest institutional funds, the language of de-risking Africa. I remember going to a G20 conference a couple of years ago, sort of organized by Germany. And they were agonizing with the same thing. Where do we invest these surplus sort of funds that our pension funds and other people have? And they say we need to de-risk Africa so that Africa can absorb these funds. So they're trying to solve their own problems of looking for places to get high returns, particularly in the era where we've had very low bond yields, because since the financial crisis. So perhaps if interest rates go up in the advanced countries, maybe this sort of pressure for hunting for yield may recede. But I think given the amount of money that the COVID shock sort of stimulus have put out, I am not hopeful that there will be a shortage of money. So I think there is a whole sort of different paradigm development that the actors out there need to come to terms with. Big money is really not what is holding us back. I think if you look at even those charts, the highest growth period of Africa in recent times, what was called Africa Rising, was post-HIPC. After sort of the liberalization reforms, post-HIPC. And in fact, at that point in time, Africa wasn't borrowing much externally. In fact, that's the time that countries' debt to GDP ratios were coming down. And then when the people looked around and said, hey, Africa has a huge headroom to borrow because countries' debt to GDP ratios are now down to the 20s. So they have headroom to borrow up to the 50s. So quick, people come in with a lot of money. Same thing with African governments. They sort of, if you offer people money, they don't turn it down. And it's all gone to mostly bad projects because it wasn't well thought through. So one of the things we need to do is to get out of this finance-led mindset of development.
Excellent. So on that note, if we could bring everyone back to the screen, because we have a lot of questions which have come in. So I think we want to move to the question and answer session. I also have a lot of questions, like I would like to follow up with each of you, but let's hear from our audiences. So let me try to put up the questions here. So one question that has come in, and we're trying to aggregate those that are similar to one another. And a question is that we have that right now all we have from the B3W is a task force. Are there any concrete plans or strategy documents to refer to? And maybe Connor can address this. So a follow-up to that is how will the B3W coordinate with existing and in pipeline infrastructure projects of the DFIs in the respective countries, the development finance institutions in respective countries. So KfW, Germany, JICA, Japan, also the ADB, the Asian Development Bank in Asia, but also the African Development Bank in Africa. So are there strategy documents to refer to, and then how will the B3W coordinate with existing projects on the ground? Connor, do you want to?
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. And this has been a great conversation so far. It's been great listening to everybody else. I would just say, in terms of strategy documents, it's still too early. They're really, I think, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. My understanding is that there is work going on behind the scenes right now to flesh this out and to develop a firmer strategy for what this will look like. As I think I alluded to in my remarks, you're talking about coordination amongst 7 DFIs, 7 aid agencies, 7 foreign ministries, along with the multilateral component to this. So I think it's going to take some time to really flesh out what this is going to look like. But I do suspect we'll have a better sense in the coming months of at least what a broader framework is going to look like for this. At least that's my hope. And I think that is the direction that we're moving in. On the second question of sort of, will this overtake sort of existing pipeline commitments? My suspicion is that a lot of the initial, if there are some initial projects that become B3W, I would guess that at least I would think most of those initial projects are going to be, let's call them rebranded projects, ones that are in the existing pipeline that are either under consideration right now for co-financing between, say, 2 or 3 of the G7 DFIs, and ones where or projects where it looks like that one of them is looking at that there is a co-financing opportunity, and so they would sort of fast track and bring in other DFIs. But I think a lot of the initial I would think a lot of the initial projects are going to be ones that are already in the pipeline, that are at an advanced due diligence stage for one or more of the DFIs.
Okay, great. So a second question is, and maybe this will go to Yuan. How can the small and medium sized countries get benefits from this competition between the BRI and the B3W? Then a follow-on to that is, how do you ensure that the G7 is responding to actual development priorities and aspirations of African countries? That this goes beyond just geopolitical rivalry with the least developed countries as collateral damage, or even increasing the risk of debt distress, as David mentioned. Then finally, a follow-on also is, more concretely, how do African countries establish relations with the B3W task force? And I think maybe that Connor can address. I think you're muted, Yuan.
Thank you. Those are great points. I'll start with the question about the perspective of the G7 countries. And I think the only thing we could do is to urge a perspective, but of course it's up to the policymakers to decide whether they'll take it. But I do want to stress that it's important not to see everything from the lens of great power rivalry, because that lens leads to self-reinforcing conspiracy theories. And then distorts the reality. So for example, conspiracy theories were convinced that China is trying to dominate the world. And so they interpreted certain failed projects as a deliberate attempt to fail. The argument is that Beijing wants them to fail so that it can seize assets. And this became a viral meme called debt trap diplomacy. Now, in reality, for those who know the situation, the reality is different. It's a series of implementation issues, often involving non-state actors who are beyond Beijing's control. So I think at the outset, if we can come to a greater consensus that seeing everything through the lens of rivalry is unproductive, it leads to politicization, and frankly, I don't expect good outcomes to come from the intention of merely wanting to counter China. The first question is great, a difficult question. I think that small and medium countries, even large countries, do feel intensely pressured to choose sides in the context of this geopolitical rivalry between two superpowers. And I think one of the things that these countries can do is to first understand that they're not choosing between alternatives. They're choosing between two different systems with different strengths and weaknesses, as I've said. And having that understanding will give them more agency and also more voice in articulating the kind of partners that they want to work with for different kinds of projects. So I would emphasize that it starts from having knowledge. I think most countries have more knowledge of the Western system, but they are much less knowledgeable about the Chinese system because of its opaqueness. So having more confidence about their differences will help these countries to be in a better footing to negotiate with the two superpowers.
Great. Connor, there was a question there about, I think, how African countries can establish relations with the B3W task force.
Yeah, I think again, this is one of those things where it's very early, and so I don't know if they're going to look at a formal mechanism to separate it out. But my sense would be is, I think there's going to be a heavy reliance on the existing on-the-ground presence that all of these countries have in the region, whether it's via their embassies or via their aid agency missions. And many of the DFIs, in fact, have a fairly significant presence. FMO has a significant regional presence. CDC has a pretty significant regional presence. DFC has more of a sort of they're trying to establish more of an on-the-ground presence. So I think it's going to likely run via this. I think the danger that you often see with this is, in the U.S. system at least, you often have someone who ends up being dual or triple or quadruple-hatted. And I think if this is really to be a larger initiative, I think or something, if it's going to be successful, you need to ensure that this isn't just, an econ officer's first or second or third or fourth priority. You want it to be their first priority. You want to have people who I think are dedicated to this as an initiative. Power Africa has been successful because Power Africa created a hub in South Africa that helps them manage the deal flow for the particular investments that they're looking at. And in fact, that was not something they originally considered, but ultimately they moved to that because they were having trouble generating the deal flow they needed for the financing they were offering.
So we have, I think we're out of time, but I think we can extend this by another 5 to 6 minutes, just so we can get through all the questions, at least many of the questions that have come in. And the next question I'm going to pose to Anzetse. So one of the people on this call today is asking is saying that Africa's infrastructure investment shortfall has long been a major barrier for development on the continent. Then the question is, why didn't the G7 recognize this demand from Africa earlier? And really, if you can tell us, what is the perspective on the ground in Kenya, but also in any other African country where you have some experience in? What is the perspective on the G7's intention now to have an expanded presence?
Thank you. I mean, that's exactly the questions we've all been asking. I mean, certainly China has been a factor in pivoting that attention to infrastructure. But I think to the point that was made before, it would have been useful if that pivot was centered on African priorities rather than centered on what is perceived to be a bit more of a geopolitical framing. I think if you look at the motivations behind, the B3W or the G7, it's true it's not just a pure geopolitical rivalry, but the reality is that we are reaching a stage, particularly with the demographic rise that Dee mentioned in his graph. We are reaching a stage where the interconnectivity of the continent is becoming crucial as a function of job creation. I think trying to separate those out is gnarly, and I think there's no clear way to separate those out. But that's why, if the priority is going to be infrastructure development for whatever motivations, it's important to center it in a continent-wide initiative that has not only government backing, but a lot of private sector backing. And I think that's the part of the infrastructure puzzle that I'm most worried about, is that the African infrastructure players, the African domestic expertise and capabilities are going to be overlooked in order to meet whatever geopolitical priorities are at hand. So I think it's really important that there is a real reckoning with, in the arena of infrastructure, because that emphasis isn't going to change, what the African priorities are, and making sure that we are speaking to those priorities. Because otherwise, it will really be African governments trying to figure out, okay, there's this money, but how can we do what we can to make it work for us? And if we lead to suboptimal outcomes in an environment where every penny counts. So I think that reckoning is something that B3W really needs to square, and that needs to be clear in the project selection it's going to be doing, and also, frankly, the prioritization of countries. Because that's just the point Connor is making, we are going to see a prioritization of countries that's going to happen. And I think that will give us the functional reality of what all this rhetoric means.
So a final question is on, and I'm going to direct that to David. The person is asking, that isn't low productivity an indication of infrastructure deficits in Africa, which means that more investment is required. So the existence of infrastructure is actually necessary for research and development, but also for productivity growth. You're muted, David.
it's a complex question. I pointed that the mismatch, one of the things I pointed out is scale mismatch. So that the infrastructure that is required could be micro irrigation. But the investors are looking for large ticket items like a railway. So we now have a new railway, but it has no impact of productivity of anything. In fact, it's a white elephant. That money could have gone into small scale irrigation, agricultural research, and many other things where there are infrastructure components. The other example is power. I just mentioned the US came into power is a big problem. Africa is a dark continent. In this part of the country of Africa, Eastern Africa, every country has a generation surplus of something like 40 to 60%, which has made electricity expensive because then you have to pay for the excess capacity. And we are now struggling with utilities with financial distress because they are over leveraged on power that they are not selling. So it's a bit more of a complex. And again, it's supply driven, finance led. That's the problem. But when all is said and done, I think, for instance, if you look at something like agricultural productivity, it's not infrastructure. The most successful segments of African economy, for instance, are export agriculture, and there is scope to scale that a lot more through market access. Yeah, I like to give example also of trade in particular. Trade is a big sort of factor, and of course, regional integration has been mentioned. When I was a young person, when I started working, a motorcycle would have cost me a year's income as a university graduate. Today, it costs about 3 times the minimum wage, and that's because of impact of China. So you see motorcycles all over Africa, everybody has one. Yeah, and that's a big sort of. You see the same thing with sectors like mobile telephony. Where this used to be. So this diffusion of durables and stuff like that through trade, then are the ones which drive productivity, and then they actually make infrastructure viable. But if you start with this, what we call in this country, if they build, they will. If you build, they will come. What you end up with is financial distress.
Excellent. So I think this is a good point to end on, and I suspect that this infrastructure versus other kinds of public goods discussion is a bit of a chicken and egg one, and it's people have very strong views on them, and I don't think we're going to resolve that now. But sorry, go on. You wanted to talk?
I was just going to make the point, one final point. This infrastructure thing, I have looked for evidence base as to that infrastructure is a constraint. I have not found a single study that is sort of rigorous. There was some numbers picked from the air by AFDP a couple of years ago, based on a very small study of just the telecoms, and it's become a big thing. But I don't know in economics which supports infrastructure-led growth. Actually, if somebody finds it, please share.
So actually now I'm starting to get ideas about hosting, a debate, written debate with written analyses, but also discussions on this subject of infrastructure, because it is now so prominent. And if, different experts have different views on it, maybe we should try to get to the root of it. Which one comes first? Is it the chicken or the egg? Is it infrastructure or other kinds of public goods? But we absolutely have to close now. Thank you so much to our distinguished speakers today who made time to engage in this, I would say, very important, very timely debate and discussion. And certainly the objective was just this, to put all these ideas on the table, because a lot of policies are being crafted as we speak. Not everything has been settled, and maybe there's still an opportunity to shape things. And this is what we want to do with the kind of discourse, with the kind of narratives that we're generating from these kinds of discussions. So thank you very much, UN Ang, Kono Savoy, David Nday, and Zester Ware, and to our audiences for joining us. But very importantly, to my colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment, this was a team effort. There are a lot of people behind the scenes who made this go on successfully. So have a nice day, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.